Good afternoon. Welcome to our session on transforming corporate training with VR. My name is Manal Houri. I lead VR learning programs at Facebook, Learning and Development. And just 2 weeks ago, I ran a session with 200 participants concurrently in VR. Great times. It was amazing. Thank you. As a learning professional myself, I could not be more excited for VR, for training. The training industry has been waiting for a really long time for a technology that could enable a lot of the possibilities that we're seeing today in VR, like walking in the shoes of others or interacting in scenarios in a very realistic yet risk-free way. So these are really great times to be in learning. And today, I'm very excited because I get to sit with 5 amazing industry leaders. Sorry, 4. I'm not counting right there. I get to sit with 4 amazing industry leaders in this space and talk to them about their experience and expertise in creating amazing training programs using VR. So let me go ahead and get started by introducing our panel. I'm going to start with Kyle. Kyle Jackson is the CEO of Tailspin. And Kyle is really focused on the future, and he's building XR solutions for the future of work. Next is Amy Lou Abernethy. Amy Lou is the CEO of AMP Creative, and she's the Chief Learning Strategist. Amy Lou brings a very unique perspective to learning in VR through design thinking and visual storytelling. Next is Hugo Avila. Hugo is the digital lead for global programs at Novartis when it comes to training and immersive programs. And Hugo's work is super touching because the work they're doing in VR is truly saving lives by creating some specialized blended training programs. And last but not least, Nick Rosa. Nick leads immersive training at Accenture. And Nick has taken on himself to solve one of the biggest challenges in VR learning these days, which is integration, tracking, data, all these fun subjects that we love to talk about.
And scale.
And scale. So welcome, panel. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yeah, great. So I can spend hours talking to these people about VR and learning, and we can geek out for days, but we only have 42 minutes left. So in the remaining time, we're going to try to have a really focused conversation around areas that are being transformed by VR in the space of training and learning and development. And we're going to look at opportunities that's also creating for people who are wanting to become developers for learning programs specifically. So, because we only have 45 minutes, we are going to talk about 4 areas. So in our discussion today, the focus will be into design and development, experience from the user or learner perspective, data, okay, Nick, we're going to talk about data, and scale and integration. We're going to start with design and then go from there. Obviously, these subjects bleed into each other, but we would like to tackle them all, so we're going to try. In this session today, there won't be a Q&A, but at the end of this session, we're going to join you at the pavilion, and you can chat with all these amazing people and ask them questions. All right? Let's dive right in.
Let's do it.
All right.
So let's start with design. So we know that VR is bringing a lot of new features to designing any kind of experience. But for learning specifically, VR is making the cool wow factor pop when it comes to learning products, unlike what we're used to when it comes to like creating e-learns or videos. So let me start with you, Amy Lou. How do you think VR is transforming the way we think about learning design?
Yeah. Well, when I think of one of the most transformative technologies that we had in learning was the written word and publishing. And so learning for a long time has been kind of rooted in a passive experience a lot of times, where the learner is just receiving information through reading or watching a video or something like that. And so when we're designing for VR, we need to completely turn that around and consider how can we deliver learning through an embodied experience, like really bringing it back to the whole, kinesthetic learning? How can we use spatial learning and all of the opportunities that opens up? So we need to tear down the way that we've thought of learning design in the past and really explore what it means to learn with your body involved.
This is interesting. Any thoughts about how we should tear down what we know about 2D learning and start fresh for VR?
One of the interesting aspects of VR is that before using normal e-learning and videos, the user was passively looking at an action that was taught to the user using normal training techniques. So in VR instead of having the kind of learning that you have using the communication that comes from a teacher to a learner, you have to be the learner that understands how things work and the mechanics of learning. And us developers need to create this environment around the learner. So it's not anymore a learning that goes from one direction to another. It's a learning that comes from inside us to the external world, which is an inside-out kind of learning, which is very, very interesting.
This is fascinating.
It makes me think of Maria Montessori's prepared environments. If any of you have little tykes that go to Montessori school, the environment is prepared so that the learner interacts and learns things from the interaction. And that's the kind of stuff that we're designing for VR, and I think that's a really good point.
So I was, so I don't come from a learning background, right? So a lot of the scaffolding and a lot of the tools that have been used in prior mediums, I didn't have any of those boundaries in thinking about this, which is interesting. And so we started going through designing, big, kind of exhaustive programs and looked at how much of, kind of the old modalities we could collapse into a single experience. Because when you start looking at what each of them was trying to do, either through, through a video or through another medium, you could see why it had to be separated out. But then when you obviously start to embody, if it is teaching investigation or if it's teaching something around difficult, conversations or process, process heavy stuff. It's like once you're embodied there, you really start to collapse a lot of those things into on top of each other. And that's where I think like the inside out stuff gets really interesting. And you start making, we've seen a lot of people make connections that aren't even in the learning, right? Like they start to expand well outside of what the content was designed for because of that. So it's, I don't know how much the old, like this is a good, it's a question because I don't pretend to know, but the, how much of the old rules are actually restrictive in design.
It makes me want to shift to Hugo and hear from him because I know you guys are building very specialized learning programs, and I wonder if the embodiment concept and the old, I'm calling them old, but the traditional learning techniques are applying in your case.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I agree with the comments made so far. I mean, I think one of the things that came through for us is really the importance of the subject matter expert when you're doing the design. In traditional e-learning, you're used to sort of creating content, and then at the end, maybe you do like a quiz, and you're sort of hoping that the user has retained the information. And I think in VR, what has come through is how important getting every part of that process that you're trying to train on is to make sure that you're getting it right and that you're doing it in as close a way as you can to the real thing, because the training that they're doing is the test in a way, right? There's no quiz at the end. In other words, if you design it right from beginning to end, they will know what that experience is, and they will be able to recall that experience once they've done it.
And this is extremely interesting because basically during the previous kind of e-learning creation, the kind of framework that was used was exactly the same kind of learning framework that you have in the classroom. Instead, with VR, you analyze the actual task that the user will have to perform in real life. And also another point that's mixed together with what you just said, Hugo, is that it's important to create a design for a VR experience that is user-centric, because we are talking about immersive media and user-centric media. So Amy, you're gonna agree with that. Design thinking and understanding the real pain points of the user while they're doing their task in real life, and understanding how to create memorable and meaningful experiences in VR for a better recall rate in real life are extremely important.
And I think that one of the things that I get really excited about too is that we are proving in task-driven processes the incredible things that VR can do for learning. But let's take tasks away and start to consider abstract learning.
Yep.
And how we can take what we've learned about tasks and about like spatial learning and apply that to abstract thoughts around ethics or behavior. How can we associate those to physical spaces and to physical interactions in ways that really transform the way people learn in those ways?
And attach complex concepts to what is called a memory palace.
Thank you.
Talking about
Spatial
that
learning is
earlier
like my
today.
jam. Yeah, I love that.
Would you like to explain what is memory palace to the...
No, please.
Okay.
It's so cool.
So memory palace is a very interesting technique, memorization technique, that is used by poker players and people that want to memorize very long numbers or very complex books,
And Sherlock
word by word. It's possible to create an imaginary path with images that are remembered better than actual words or numbers, because our brain is not built to remember 2D information. We are not built to remember numbers or words. We are built to remember space. And this comes to the fact that we are coming from, we are evolved primates, and our brain evolved through centuries and millennia to remember where is the closest source of food, where is the closest shelter, where are our friends and the people that we live with. So that's why spatial learning is so important. And if you're able to attach a specific place to a specific word or a specific number, and you can create a mental path with all those images, you can remember very complex information.
Thank you for explaining that. I think this is a great segue for us to talk about experience, because now we used to live in a world where content is king, like instructional designers say, and now we're moving to talking about tasks and areas we're trying to build for and scenarios we're trying to solve for. So all this puts the user again at the center of the experience. So in learning, when we talk about learning experience, typically a learner starts with probably clicking in a learning management system to start or launch a course, or click on a video or an e-learn. And this is done through a commodity device that they've used all their lives, probably, a computer or a mobile phone. With VR, we're seeing a complete shift in this process. We start from a new hardware that we're placing on our faces. We're using completely different interfaces, completely different interaction features. So the experience is definitely changing. And I want to ask the panel, like, what do you guys think is making VR experiences compelling and immersive today?
I think this is a really hard question for where we are right now.
I'll ask it like next year.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because obviously there's been ways that you can make really compelling experiences that wow audiences or wow clients, but then also ultimately are not building a foundation for the kind of memory palace scaffolding or some of the really rich measurement and stuff that takes in kind of infrastructure and plumbing behind the scenes.
Right.
And so I think there's been a lot of people making trade-offs early on between just trying to prove the lowest level of why it's compelling.
Right.
And probably not enough investment in the stuff that's going to actually change learning design, because we're going to find things, as we get deeper and deeper into the plumbing, deeper into the measurement, also deeper into, getting rid, hand tracking, right? Getting rid of controllers,
Yes.
making things disappear, then it's going to change again. And so it's like a little bit of a difficult time to answer this question with where we are, in my opinion.
One of the things, I agree. We're working within so many limitations, right?
Yeah.
And we're trying to build these things. We know what could be, but we're like, we don't quite have the way to get there. And yet, the same things that make other experiences compelling, human storytelling, finding the human heart of the experience and drawing people in through storytelling, I think, is a really important way to make anything compelling and immersive. We can bridge a lot of gaps when we are compelled by a story. But I also think of embodiment, spatial learning, and kinetic learning are other ways that we just make people feel like they're in something.
Yeah, I would say one thing that's important is when you're doing this, one way to make it more compelling is it all starts with engagement. And I think also making sure that you have like really high production value. So when we started doing this, even though it was a training simulation of someone performing a particular process in a lab, we wanted to be as realistic and as authentic as we could with that. And this becomes really clear once the user starts testing it. So just because it's a training for a corporate level doesn't mean that it can't be engaging or it can't feel or be highly produced. And I think that's really important. So we're going in through looking at every level, including sounds, including haptic feedback for when they touch different things and use different things. Because again, once the better you're able to do that and replicate it to the real life environment, the more engaged the user will be.
I think it's almost a requirement, right? Because the expectation is that's what they're going to see. Yeah. Everybody's a consumer at the end of the day, and they're all expecting kind of AAA, quality now. So if they step, I think corporate learning specifically has had a challenge with this, right? Because the quality bar hasn't been as high as the media that you experience elsewhere. And so here's an opportunity to obviously kind of challenge that expectation. And you don't get that often, that opportunity with a new medium that often. So anything less than like super compelling is just a massive delay. Right?
Really agree.
The user experience, from my point of view, is absolutely key to create something compelling and immersive. We try to replicate the real life environment digitally, but we often forget about the fact that the user doesn't want to have pop-up menus. The user wants to use hands, wants to use voice, wants to act naturally in an environment exactly like they do in real life. So immersiveness comes both from great graphical fidelity, but also comes from a great user experience. And that has to be absolutely natural.
Can we try and connect the gaming industry with the learning industry today? Like a lot of developers probably in our audience are thinking, I want to try and become a developer specifically for learning use cases. And I'm sure they have done a lot of compelling immersive work. What are some traits or skills that we look for in the gaming industry that we should bridge over to the learning industry?
Like technically or design or?
Through design and experience, yes.
I would say spatial interaction, understand how to create interaction between the user and the digital assets and models. That's very, very important. In a natural way, in a way that creates a meaningful memory and experience for the user, create an emotional impact.
I think that we desperately need people who think differently to come into learning design. I think we desperately need people who create compelling narratives, who look to engage users and reward them for certain behaviors. I think people who think in 3 dimensions and can design for those sorts of environments are really important. I think we need you. Come on in. Yeah, for sure.
One of the things that we saw like a really surprising amount of response to was focusing on some of the AAA nuance that you only really see in like high-end media entertainment or gaming, and so going back to kind of create that initial like wow factor, you can focus on one specific aspect of something that you used to do really well in gaming and bring it over. In our case, it was kind of all around emotional realism of a character, right? And so once you experience that in VR and you actually had an emotional experience, that was a no turning back point for people. Just like the Plank experience was for a lot of the gamers. You went and you went, like, what, that really tricked my brain. Now I'm all in.
Yep.
Right, and so there's a bunch of those, between spatial design, definitely on the measurement side, but I think there's a lot of stuff in gaming that's going to fall into, if you just, pick one.
Yeah, going back to the spatial design and back to you, Nick, on that, we have today like 3 degrees of freedom and 6 degrees of freedom, depending on which headset we're talking about. What is that going to do to increase or decrease or make the experience compelling and more immersive when it comes to learning, of course?
Well, there are multiple things, like for example, enable headset to have full body tracking. We are experimenting with that with full body suits and haptic gloves, and we've done some very interesting POCs, and now we're trying to scale those POCs for some of our clients. So body presence and full body tracking is going to be key from my point of view. Also, I think that it's important to track in a much better way biometric data from the user, both in terms of galvanic response and heartbeat, but also there are some ways right now to understand the muscular strain of the user during the VR experience. When it comes to dexterity, you can understand when the user is fatigued and is not probably fit enough for the experience in real life. So there are multiple things that can increase the value of the experience.
I asked you this question because I knew you're going to answer and segue us into data. So,
Of course.
Perfect. Data for learning professionals is like the ultimate goal. We are trying to find ways to measure what we call the return on learning investment, the ROL. And typically in the learning industry, we use some classical metrics to measure this return on investment, to measure impact and effectiveness of training programs. In VR, the game has completely changed. We are now introducing new features. We can track eye gaze, and we can track hesitation, and we can track gestures in a way that we could not do ever before in 2D learning. So this is what makes the topic of data so meaty, and want everybody to kind of contribute to it in this conversation. I'm very interested to hear from the panel on whether they have seen some successful data strategies that are enabled in VR today.
So I kind of want to set up Kyle to tell one of his stories.
I'm looking at
I
all
think
of you,
it's really
all of you
cool.
have good stories.
Well, I mean, because sometimes you go in with a plan, you have a hypothesis, and you know what you're like. I know
where you're going now.
Yeah. So sometimes you have a hypothesis. You should have a plan to test and iterate on this hypothesis, and your data is going to help you do that. But sometimes it's a bear trap. You are gathering data, and then you're going to parse it and find insights from that data and get curious about them and see what they mean. And that can lead to the most amazing aha moments. Kyle, I think you have something to contribute.
Yes, we have something there. So we, so obviously with the variety of types of experiences you can give, right? So if you think of simulation, and I'm going to go through and I'm going to try a different type of scenario. This may have been randomized for me over time, and now I'm instead of going and doing kind of one pass at something, I'm going to try something 10 or 15 times. We built that for process-based learning, and we built that for conversational-based learning. And so in the conversational stuff, we actually had a scenario that I was sharing with Amy where you were going in to try and sell a CEO new services, so it was a sales training, right? And the scenario was exactly the same. Literally the branches were the same. The only thing that changed was the environment and the virtual human. And in one scenario, the virtual human was an older gentleman, and the other was a younger female. And through observation, they saw users interact differently. Even though the content was the exact same. And so it ended up becoming, and it wasn't necessarily data capture, but it was everybody observed it, to where that then became a topic for discussion for diving into bias, like your own biases. And so it was kind of like an aha moment, because obviously that's something that could easily have been measured in the back end. It just wasn't the intent of the design. And so you kind of open up Pandora's box a bit with this, because you start to look at all the intangible and like adjacent data points that you can start collecting, and they're vast, and not just in experience, but like what does it mean inside of an organization, and how does that start the change management process? How do you corral that? Because once it starts, it's fierce, and you really have to start to figure out, how does this VR animal inside of a large organization, turn into something that actually, creates the change that you aimed for, and at the same time, like, be aware of these other things that are happening adjacent that might actually be, the actual more measurable results that people would actually point to as the success points. So it's really been interesting to watch, like, the adjacent stuff pop up to what you actually, your initial assumption was.
Totally. I wonder what is the role of the business or the client, and when we're bringing all this data, we're collecting all this data, and we're looking to bring them insights that impact business decisions. What should we focus on? What's the role the client should play when we are bringing them on the journey of VR training and convincing them, you should go for VR training, and here's why?
There are a lot of very interesting magic tricks that you can do in VR. You can track spatial data of user performance. We have run an experiment in our R&D lab in Ireland. Very interesting one. 2 million data points in 10 minutes of experience, tracking spatial data of the user doing interactions in VR in a clean room scenario for pharma. And so we trained a reinforced learning algorithm to understand, to do a predictive analytics for human errors. So we were able to predict when an action was leading to an error in the virtual training. The interesting thing is that those spatial data, now that we have also finger tracking, can be ported into real-life scenario for augmented reality predictive analytics. So collecting data in VR can lead to use those data also in real-life environments. And in the future, we could potentially use those data also for robotic automation, because robots and machines that are now used in manufacturing, for example, are working all on trajectories, best trajectory possible. And this kind of data can be useful also to enable automation.
Yeah. I wonder if Hugo has more data stories for us from his.
I wanted to add something, because I think there's a couple of things. One is the design is important, but also the observation. So not just implementing it, but also observing how they're using it and looking at what's coming back. So I'll give you a quick example. So in the application that we built, it's built in such a way, in a very detailed way, together with the subject matter expert, where if the person gets any part of that process wrong, they're not able to continue. So the system will automatically let them know. It'll flash red, and then they'll have to start again. This is something that that was actually quite valuable from a training perspective. The feedback we got from the subject matter experts was that in real life, it's difficult to enforce certain parts of compliance when you're doing real life training. But because they're able to do it in VR, the user will know precisely what they're doing wrong and at what point. And the application enforces them to repeat that activity until they get it right. So in essence, they're reinforcing against compliance and making sure that they have the right process before they go through, rather than making a mistake, not really knowing, and continuing. The other is also the design of the spaces and what you build around. So, if in our case, again, we have a digital twin of a lab. And normally we think, okay, it's a digital twin, but the way people interact is important. So in one case, or in one part of the training, they actually need to go underneath some equipment to check something. And what we found out was that when people were, so they were kind of crouching, and when they're coming back up, there was a table, graphics table, obviously inside of the VR. And when they were getting back up, they were actually putting their arm in VR to try to get up, and they would lose their balance. And so this is something that, just by the general design, you wouldn't have thought of it, but if you actually observe them doing the training, you realize that that's something that maybe can be optimized. So I think the observational aspect is also interesting.
This is fascinating.
I think it's really early. I mean, the only spaces that have actually, I think, taken a more planned out approach has been healthcare, because of the clinical trials and the regulations. I mean, everywhere else it's super early for figuring out what to track and how to track, and then fold those back into metrics that matter for the business.
Totally.
Obviously, a lot of the learning management systems don't really support this stuff yet, so it doesn't fold back into a overall dashboard where the business can make data-driven decisions.
Yep.
So there's probably a lot to learn from the clinical, the process that you guys have been implementing from observation standpoint to actually get to what are the standards for measurement.
Yeah. Because I was about to say, it's the same. I think that there are successful data strategies enabled by VR, but there's also the problem of big data anywhere, where you just have so much information and so few people who have the expertise or the time or the money or what have you to go back through that, find actionable items to iterate on.
And just to quickly add to Kyle's point, I think that's a really important part. Maybe not everybody may or may not be aware, but when it comes to the application is one thing, but in enterprise learning, this is just a small piece. I mean, the learning management system is actually quite key. In our case, it's actually one of the challenges that we're trying to work through now, because until the management systems, the big ones, sort of start supporting it, making sure that you can deploy and the content and track the results of that training, which is not a key part, not just a key part, it's a mandatory part in our case. And so that's really important as well. And I think this is where we're still evolving in terms of having a complete solution for enterprise learning.
This is great. Nick, you have something to add?
No, I just wanted to echo what Kyle and you just said. The learning management system will be absolutely key to enable successful data strategies for the enterprise. Because if right now we are not tracking VR-specific metrics in the LMS systems, we are not going to be able to use those data in a meaningful way in the future.
Yeah, it's slowing down adoption.
Yeah.
Because the data points are there, and you can, it's taking either really good measurement that happens to help in a few sectors, or it happens to take like a really lucky performance consultant that came in early in the process, and they lay out like, here's the things that if we can measure, and you can prove that you move the needle on this, then
the business priority.
And then it goes. But without one of those, kind of like two very fortunate events, you're basically adding 6 or 12 months to kind of whatever the next cycle is on moving forward. So until that stuff starts to fold back into the business, I think it's really slowing us down.
Yeah, and it's interesting how both of you, or 4 of you, all mentioned LMS, and LMS is the term we use for learning management system. In the learning industry, we have a love-hate relationship with LMSs because they are always solutions that we are stuck with for the most part, and we're trying to get them to do more things than they can. And LMSs today are not geared up to be able to support VR type of learning. So that's why we needed to talk about integration in our next section, because integrating with ecosystems that already exist for the learning departments is a must. Today, most of us do VR learning in a vacuum, like we do them as special programs and special projects, and they are not yet tied very intimately with existing platforms and ecosystems. And this is also another hindrance for scale. So that's why we tied up integration and scale in this part of the discussion, and I'm hoping you guys can help us figure out ways to integrate. And how are you doing the integration today, and how are you scaling these programs?
Very slowly.
Very slowly.
It's difficult to move away from the glorified POC phase. And this is due to many factors. The user experience is not yet there in most of the cases, but also some of the stakeholders that are supposed to be involved in the initial conversation of the POC phase to set some very clear KPIs for the experience are not involved. And another thing that is very important is that most of the clients that we're working with right now, they're not VR ready. And I'm not just talking about an LMS that supports VR. I'm talking about creating a frictionless production of digital immersive experiences with, for example, a pipeline of digital twin that can enable the frictionless creation of environments for learning. So we need to help our clients to understand their level of maturity and help them to fill those gaps and stop trying to create a rocket ship, but start with a minimum viable product that will enable them to provide value to the enterprise from the beginning of the journey.
Yeah, I think there's a step before concurrently with the LMS, which is authoring platforms for VR learning, which would allow people to create very lightweight ways to share and scale learning in VR. And it's like, I get excited about that authoring platform, but I also get scared because I'm concerned about building for what we can do right now when there are so many possibilities. But I think an authoring platform would be sweet.
Right. And today, Maria, in the keynote, she said, if it doesn't scale, it doesn't matter. And when I heard her say that, I was like, in panic. I'm like, we have to make it scale.
One of the things that's happened to one of the engagement that we have with an oil and gas client was that they really wanted to create an experience that was future-proof. Yeah. And then they came to us and they said, we want something that's, will work with VR. And I said, okay, how many headsets do you want to deploy? And they said, none. So you want an experience that works with VR without having any headsets? And I said, yes. So you have to think out of the box. We had to build an experience that worked with WebGL on a platform that we're using in Accenture that is working with web interactions. And whenever the company is going to be ready to embrace VR, we're going to flip the switch and it's going to work out of the box on headsets. So sometimes VR, pure VR, is not the answer for scale. You need to start with a lower level.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, at the early days, kind of like Kyle was mentioning before, it's we're trying to be very selective about what we do and how we do it. So we're speaking to, there's actually, for a large company like Novartis, you'd be surprised, we have actually quite a lot of interest in this area. But we're trying to be purposely selective about the use cases and about the solutions that we're trying to implement, because more importantly than just, we don't want to do VR for the sake of VR. We want to do VR in a way that has impact. And we want to do it in a way, and that's really important, because if we do it just for the sake of doing it, it won't create the buy-in that we need in order to get to the level where, when we want to scale. And so we want to be very conscious of that and really looking at the use cases specifically, and then going back to the business partners and saying, look, for this use case, it would make sense. For this, you can use these other methods. And I think it's really important to look at, because it can be tempting, obviously, to just go for VR. But if you really want to develop it in a way that will get you to a point of scaling, you have to be able to show and prove value every step of the way.
Totally.
That's a good point.
It's a really good. So we've gone through enough POCs now with most of, at least I think the enterprise space has gone through enough POCs to where they're actually looking for more scalable frameworks and methods to develop content. And one of the challenges, obviously, with, at least in the real-time side of this, right, the game engine side of this, the actual underlying platforms we're using to build a lot of this content on top of have historically built things that get built and then released, and then kind of they live their life. They don't get maintained like enterprise software does over years. And so one of the challenges that we've seen a lot in this topic, the bigger you get, like, so when you get to a company that says, okay, we have conviction, we have 12 development hubs globally, and we want to go. And they say, how do we do that? Because right now, all of them are developing different. There's not common methodologies for this. There's obviously not common reporting. And so you've got like a real standardization and kind of like, you need to put some really strong foundations underneath some of these companies so that they can actually make the jump that they already want to make. And so I think it's a huge opportunity for the developer community, right? Because we have really powerful authoring tools already, but they need a layer of sophistication on top of them to make them essentially enterprise ready, so that a company that's going to put an application out that is going to get updated every year, with either new equipment or a new process or whatever, doesn't have to be rewritten or completely debugged because the engine completely changed,
right.
6 months later.
Yeah.
And we've seen that a lot in a lot of the early deployments. So I think that, to me, that's one of the huge opportunities for the development community is to focus on that layer. It could be authoring tools. It can be, there's all sorts of ways to accomplish that. But that layer is obviously, I think, one of the things that you're going to start to see a lot of the people that have bought in early, like they're now looking for that.
They want that.
Yeah, they're looking for that. And so there's going to be a number of contracts that you'll see in the enterprise space relatively soon, I would imagine, that are going to be, $10 million partnerships or $20 million partnerships across the organization, because they've got so many use cases to build that unless they figure out that base layer, they know that they're going to be in a world of pain in 24 months when it's not just hand tracking, it's all these other things on top of it. And so they need a consistent way to move forward.
What about personalization in this case? Would personalization have to pay the price for scaling, or can we solve for both while we're building this infrastructure? Crystal ball.
Well, you said the word
solve for both.
price, which, I mean, with enough money,
Maybe.
it could go both ways. But I'm sorry, did you have something?
No,
I
I'm still
cut you off?
thinking. That's a hard. That's a,
Well, I mean, if you think of the information that a learning management system holds about a learner, if you can pull that in and use those levers, then personalization within a virtual environment could be increased, but it would cost money.
we need the same roadmap that we get at the end of every keynote for the future of the hardware for this question.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which is like, okay, step one, LMS integration at this level. Step two,
please.
repeatable frameworks that you can, you can measure those things and do, and essentially walk through those big gating opportunities. I mean, they're not really,
Totally.
That's what's so exciting, right? Every one of those is a really interesting opportunity.
I just wanted to add one last thing about this topic. It's important to learn from what happened with mobile transformation for the enterprise. There are some very successful models that have been applied to the enterprise by mobile companies and consultancies in transformation with mobile. So thinking about, for example, not only the POC and the initial pilots and then scaling, but also all the ancillary service, like, for example, change management, support, training, maintenance of the application. And if you can't do it yourself, try to see if there are partners that are willing to approach those clients with you that can support you in those kind of steps, because the clients are going to ask you for that, that's for sure.
Awesome. We're running out of time, but I have really one last burning question for you guys. Let's say it's year 2025, and we're gathered here again, all of us at OC12. What's going to be the headline for VR and corporate training? Can you guys give me like 30 seconds or 45-second answers? Putting you all on the spot.
Personalization of the learning experience based on behavioral data.
Yeah.
Like that.
I think we'll see a lot more complex work enter the gig economy. I think we'll be able to get skilled, proficiently skilled at such a pace that we'll actually see work that you would never have thought would be part of a kind of a gig model will just become commonplace.
Okay.
I would say hopefully we'll have a level of immersion that is almost comparable to the real life thing in terms of immersion, in terms of realism, and the ability to really have the complementary data systems and learning systems to provide, again, a complete solution.
Wonderful.
I think that for those of us who have been in corporate training and learning for a while, the aspirational things that happen in gaming or happen when the future is unevenly distributed in places like medical training and things like that aren't necessarily going to hit corporate training for a while. It's just going to lag behind a little bit. But in 2025, I'm hoping that we're there with the sorts of experiences that we're seeing in gaming now. It's really what I think we'll see.
That's awesome. That's very promising. And those are really great predictions.
What about yours? You can't.
What do you think, Manal?
I don't want to have an opinion today. I'll reserve it till OC12, and I'll say, haha, I told you so. The industry of learning is really poised to take a giant leap into everything you guys are saying. Like, this is my hope for 2025, that we'll be really in an immersive space, trackable, personalized, scalable at all levels, providing all insights and telling us stories that we can share with the business to make really true, move the needle type decisions. So the time is really now, like the theme of this conference is, for us to take on this journey. I want to thank you guys so much and thank our audience for being with us today. Thank you all for sharing your experiences and expertise. Thank you, Kyle, Emilou, Hugo, and Nick. And thank you guys so much for staying with us. After this session, we can meet you all at the pavilion for some chatting with the panel. You are also invited to the Enterprise Happy Hour. It's taking place at 5:15 till 6:15 at the Hilton Winchester Ballroom. So you'd like to hang out there too, we'd love to see you. Thank you all and have a great time at OC6.
Great job, Manal.
Great job, you all.